Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates. Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 2nd of April 2022 of the New Delhi edition. The topics we discuss today have been presented on a screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Before starting with today's discussion, there is a small announcement for all of you. The Prelims Compass 2022 on Budget and Economic Survey has been made available on the Amazon platform for all the students. This particular compass basically includes all the important topics as well as concepts which I had discussed as part of my Budget and Economic Survey discussion. The link to this particular compass for the Amazon has been provided in the description box below. As far as the Prelims Compass for the other subjects is concerned, you need not worry. The Prelims Compass for the other subjects would soon be made available. Now this particular article appears on page number 10. The article is titled as Drugs Consignments in the Containers, Making the Indian Ports New Playground for the International Dealers. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Internal Security. Now before discussing in what way this article becomes important, let me first give you the background to this article. Now, this particular article highlights that the international crime syndicates have increasingly resorted to the drug trafficking through the containerized trade network. So what happens is, if a particular exporter is exporting goods to other countries, such an exporter is required to give a kind of self-declaration as to what goods are actually contained in the container used for the international trade. And normally, according to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, hardly 2% of these containers which are presently used in the international trade, they are actually inspected by the officials. So remaining almost like 98% of the containers used in the international trade, they are not even inspected by the officials. So this particular loophole is in turn exploited by the international crime syndicates. So what international crime syndicates are doing here is either they give a false declaration as to what goods are contained in the container. For example, if say they're exporting drugs, but they may give a false declaration that a particular container is containing a talcum powder. Secondly, these international crime syndicates are also concealing the drugs in the containers. So this has given rise to the drug trafficking through the containerized trade network. The best example in the recent days happens to be the Mundra port. So I hope all of you must be knowing that recently the Mundra port was in news because almost around 3000 kg of heroin was seized from this Mundra port. So in the light of the recent developments which have taken place in the Mundra port, as well as this particular article, various aspects of the drug trafficking becomes important from the perspective of your UPSC Prelims as well as the mains examination. As you can see, already in mains 2018, a question has been asked directly with respect to the drug trafficking in India. So what we will do here is we will understand all the aspects related to the drug trafficking. So we will look into what do you mean by the drug trafficking, what are the reasons for the drug trafficking, and what kind of steps has the Indian government taken so far in order to crack down on the drug trafficking. So based upon our discussion, you should be in a position to write an answer to this particular mains question for practice. The question here is, drug trafficking has emerged as one of the largest threats to the internal security. In the light of this statement, highlight the reasons for the growing drug trafficking in India. Also discuss various steps taken by Indian government to deal with the problem of drug menace. And then you have these two prelims question for practice whose answers you should be able to attend once we are done with the discussion. Let us now look into various aspects of drug trafficking, starting with understanding its meaning. Drug trafficking refers to the global illicit trade involving the cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, and sale of narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. So it is basically a illegal or illicit trade of narcotic and psychotropic substances. So what exactly are the narcotic drugs? Narcotic drugs are the substances that are used to treat moderate to severe pain. For example, You must have heard that morphine as such, it is used to relieve pain in the patients who are suffering from cancer. Similarly, the psychotropic substances are the substances that bring about changes in the mood, behavior, or thoughts of a particular person. So normally such psychotropic substances may be used in the medicines which are used to treat depression, anxiety problems, and so on. So if you look at the narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances, they have even the medical application. So use of these substances in moderation can help the patients, particularly in terms of relief from the pain, or it may change their mood or behavior. But the problem is these narcotic drugs or the psychotropic substances, they are also used for recreational purposes by some of the people. And the trade in such narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances which are used for recreational purposes is referred to as the drug trafficking. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, India has emerged as a major hub for both transit as well as destination of the narcotic and psychotropic substances. So what are the major reasons for the growing drug trafficking in India? Let us look into these reasons one by one. The first reason is obviously the geographical location because of India's proximity to the Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle. As you can see in this particular diagram here, India lies between two areas which are well known for the illegal cultivation, manufacturing and sale of the narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. Towards its west, we have the Golden Crescent. So this Golden Crescent basically includes countries that is Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iran. And this Golden Crescent area is quite well known for the production of hashish as well as heroin. So the heroin and hashish grown in these countries is actually smuggled into some of the bordering states in India such as Gujarat, Rajasthan, Jammu Kashmir, Punjab and so on. Similarly, towards our east, we have the Golden Triangle. So this Golden Triangle includes countries such as Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam and Thailand. So from this Golden Triangle area, huge amount of drugs are in turn smuggled into India, particularly into the northeastern part of India. So if you look at the reasons for the drug trafficking towards this side of the border, it is predominantly because of the presence of various insurgent and extremist groups which are operating in the northeastern part of India. It could be because of the porous border that we have with countries such as Myanmar. So because of its location between the Golden Crescent and Golden Triangle, India has emerged as major hub both for the purpose of transit of the drugs as well as destination for the drugs. The second reason could be attributed to the problems in the border management, which can include lack of fencing, poor surveillance of border areas, lack of coordination between multiple agencies involved in border management and so on. For example, some of you must have seen the Udta Punjab movie, and in this Udta Punjab movie, you must have come across a particular scene in which small packets of drugs, they are thrown across the border from Pakistan into India. And these drug packets are in turn picked up by the local drug traffickers and then distributed throughout the state. So this is one modus operandi as to how the drugs are smuggled or transported across the border from Pakistan into India. Similarly, some of the drug smugglers also bury huge amount of drugs, particularly closer to the border area along the Indo-Pakistan. And when this particular drug is buried, this particular drug is in turn retrieved by the drug traffickers based in India. So there are a number of ways in which this kind of drug smuggling takes place across the border, and this is on account of poor fencing, poor surveillance, lack of coordination between multiple agencies and so on. The next is obviously because of the growing higher demand for the drugs in India. So these reasons could be attributed to the changing cultural values, higher unemployment, peer pressure, which is in turn forcing a large number of people to take up the drugs. Next one is with respect to poor implementation. Right now, in order to ensure that the narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances are not illegally cultivated, manufactured or distributed, we have come up with an act known as the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985. So as you can see, this particular act here puts a complete prohibition on cultivation, manufacturing, transportation, export and import of various narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. But problem once again here is we are not being able to effectively implement this particular act, and a large number of people are illegally cultivating the opium poppy as well as cannabis within India. Similarly, under the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act, we have set up Narcotics Control Bureau as a nodal agency to crack down on the illegal drugs. But once again, this agency on its own is not being able to function efficiently because it requires active coordination from other multiple agencies such as the Customs Department, Directorate of Revenue Intelligence, State Police Department, and so on. So because of this lack of coordination between multiple agencies, we are not being able to prevent the drug trafficking in India. Next one is obviously misuse of the maritime containerized trade. So as that article has highlighted that now the international crime syndicates are using the maritime containerized trade for the drug smuggling. So usually these international crime syndicates, what they do is they try to smuggle the drugs into India through a false declaration of container goods. Like I explained earlier, that they may falsely declare that a particular container may contain the talcum powder, wherein in reality the container may be containing certain drugs. Similarly, they also try to conceal the drugs in the containers. And the best example obviously happens to be the recent seizure of 300 kg of heroin in the Mundra port in the state of Gujarat. The next problem is with respect to diversion of prescription drugs towards the recreational uses. So as I said, some of these drugs, they are used for the medicinal purposes. For example, it is used as a painkiller for the people who are suffering from cancer. It may be used as a medicine for the people who are suffering from depression, etc. So in reality, the prescription drugs as such, they may contain some of these narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. But these prescription drugs are in turn getting diverted towards the recreational uses, and that has also led to the growing drug trafficking. For example, according to the World Drug Report 2021, which is published by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, India is now among the top 10 countries with respect to the diversion of prescription drugs towards the recreational uses. And the last and most important reason is obviously the growing technological advancements or the developments which have made it quite possible for the people across India to order and pay for the drugs. So now it has become easier for the people to order the drugs by the use of darknet, and drugs once ordered, the payment of such drugs can be made through the cryptocurrencies. And once the payment is made through the cryptocurrencies, it becomes extremely difficult for the authorities to crack down on this sale of drugs either to the darknet or to the payment of cryptocurrencies. Now coming to various steps taken by the Indian government in order to crack down on the drug trafficking. So in the UPSC mains examination, whenever you are required to write an answer, instead of writing the points in a random manner, always try to arrange the points under the broad dimensions. So when you arrange the points under the broad dimensions, your answer would look much more structured and your answer will be arranged in a more logical and a coherent manner. For example, if you look at the steps taken by the Indian government to prevent and control the drug trafficking, instead of writing all of these points randomly, here as you can see I have arranged these points under the broad dimensions. For example, the broad dimensions which I have covered include the constitutional framework, legal framework, institutional framework, policy framework, and so on. So what you could also do here is, under the broad dimensions, you have to arrange these points and then you can write an answer. In that way, your answer would look much more structured. So let us look into various steps taken by the government to control the drug trafficking, starting with the constitutional framework. I hope all of you must have studied Article 47, which is one of the directive principles of state policy. Article 47 of the Indian Constitution provides that the state shall endeavour to prohibit the consumption of intoxicating drinks and drugs. But at the same time, Article 47 provides for an exception, that is exceptional for the purpose of medicine. So if there are certain drugs which can be used for the purpose of medicines, then such drugs should not be prohibited. So Article 47 explicitly states that except those drugs which can be used for the purpose of medicine, all other drugs would have to be prohibited by the government. So based upon this particular spirit behind Article 47 of the Indian Constitution, we have come up with the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1985. Under this particular act, the government has been empowered to prohibit the cultivation, manufacturing, transportation, export and import of the narcotic drugs as well as the psychotropic substances. But at the same time, if there are any narcotic drugs, if there are any psychotropic substances which can be used for the purpose of medicine or for the purpose of scientific purposes, that is for the purpose of research and development, then they will not be prohibited. So please do understand here that NDPS Act obviously enables the cultivation, manufacturing, transportation, import and export of drugs which are used for the purpose of medicine or for the purpose of research and development. But if they are used for the purpose of recreation, then there is complete prohibition. This is the first important provision. Secondly, this particular act also empowers the central government to regulate the cultivation of opium poppy as well as coca plant for the medical and scientific purposes. Now, what this means here is that the central government can issue license to a particular person or an entity in India to cultivate opium poppy or the coca plant. Coca plant is basically a plant from which the cocaine is derived. So central government can obviously issue a license, but the restriction here is the opium poppy or the coca here as such, it has to be used only for the purpose of medicine or for the purpose of research and development. And who can give the permission? The permission has to be given by the central government. On similar lines, the state government have been empowered to provide for a license for the cultivation of cannabis for medical and scientific purposes. So please understand the difference here. It is the central government who has been empowered to issue licenses for the cultivation of opium poppy and the coca plant. And in case of cannabis, it is the state government which has been empowered to issue the license. As of now, the central government has not issued any license for the cultivation of coca plant. Similarly, the state governments have not issued the license for the cultivation of cannabis. But right now, the central government issues the license for the cultivation of opium poppy. In fact, India is one among the few countries which has been authorized to legally cultivate opium poppy. Further, this particular act also provides for the stringent punishment for the violation of its provisions. Now coming to the institutional framework. So as I said, in order to control the narcotic drugs, we have a separate act which was formulated in the year 1985. Now in order to implement this particular act, the government of India has set up the Narcotics Control Bureau. So the main mandate of the Narcotics Control Bureau is to implement the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. So it basically looks into prevention of drug trafficking. It investigates various cases related to drug trafficking, and it also cooperates with the other agencies in order to crack down on the illegal drug trafficking. Please note here that the Narcotics Control Bureau functions under the Ministry of Home Affairs and it was established in 1986. We have one more organization which stands for the Central Bureau of Narcotics. Please do not confuse between Narcotics Control Bureau and the Central Bureau of Narcotics. The mandate and when these two organizations have been set up is completely different. Now, for example, as I said earlier, India is one among the few countries which has been authorized to legally grow the opium poppy. Apart from that, India is in fact the only country in the world which produces the opium gum. See, opium gum is in fact extracted from the opium poppy, and this opium gum is in turn used to extract the narcotic drugs such as the morphine. So as I said earlier, morphine is basically a narcotic drug which is administered to the patients who are suffering from cancer in order to relieve them from the pain. So this particular morphine is actually extracted from the opium gum, which in turn is produced from the opium poppy. So India is the only country in the world which can legally produce the opium gum. So when it comes to the main mandate of the Central Bureau of Narcotics, this Central Bureau of Narcotics issues the licenses to the farmers for the cultivation of opium poppy. Right now, this cultivation of opium poppy is undertaken in certain notified tracts of 3 states, that is UP, MP and Rajasthan. And only those farmers who have been licensed to cultivate opium poppy from the Central Bureau of Narcotics, only those farmers can do so. If anyone else is cultivating opium poppy without getting a license, then it is considered to be a punishable offense under the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. So here, the Central Bureau of Narcotics basically issues licenses for the cultivation of opium poppy. Once this opium poppy is cultivated, it is in turn procured by the Central Bureau of Narcotics, and once various substances are extracted by the Central Bureau of Narcotics, these substances are in turn sold to the pharmaceutical drug companies based in India. So this Central Bureau of Narcotics was established way earlier in 1950, but the Narcotics Control Bureau was established in 1986. And please understand the one more important difference. Narcotics Control Bureau functions under the Ministry of Home Affairs, whereas the Central Bureau of Narcotics functions under the Ministry of Finance, to be more specific, the Department of Revenue. Apart from the legal and institutional framework, we also have a policy framework, that is the National Policy on Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances. Then India has also signed 3 international conventions as part of crackdown on the drug trafficking. These international conventions include the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs 1961, Convention on Psychotropic Substances 1971, United Nations Convention Against Illicit Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances 1988. Apart from that, we have improved our border management through enhanced surveillance through drones, smart fences, better coordination between agencies. Then we have also signed a number of bilateral agreements with neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc. to crack down on drug trafficking. We have signed the BIMSTEC Convention as well as SAARC Convention in order to crack down on the drug trafficking. And lastly, the government of India has come up with the Nasha Mukt Bharat Annual Action Plan 2020-21. Under this particular program, the idea of the government is to enhance the community awareness in 272 most affected districts across India. So these are some important aspects which become quite important as far as your UPSC mains and prelims examination is concerned. So based upon our discussion, please try to attempt these 2 prelims questions for practice and let me know the answer in the comment section given below. Apart from that, also try to write an answer to this particular mains question for practice. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 12. Now this article highlights that recently the Reserve Bank of India has decided to reduce the limits on ways and means advances to the states as well as union territories. So as far as your prelims examination is concerned, various things become important. For example, how does the government borrow the money? What instruments does the government use in order to borrow the short-term and long-term loans? And some important details related to the Retail Direct platform which the RBI has recently launched. Now, why do these topics become important? As you can see in prelims 2021 as well as in prelims 2018, we had questions related to various aspects of the government's borrowing, and that is why this particular topic becomes extremely important from the perspective of your UPSC prelims examination. So what we will do here is, as part of the analysis of this particular topic, we will focus on these 3 important aspects, and once we discuss these aspects, we will take up almost around 7 questions for practice. So let us start our discussion with respect to first aspect of the discussion, that is, how does the government borrow the money? See, the government of India can borrow money outside India. In that case, it is referred to as the external borrowings, and it can borrow money within India, in which case it is referred to as the domestic borrowings. When it comes to the external borrowings of the government, please do understand here that the external borrowings of the government, it is managed by the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance, while the domestic borrowings, they are managed by the Reserve Bank of India. So when it comes to the domestic borrowings, here the Reserve Bank of India acts as a debt manager, which means it manages the overall debt that is the domestic borrowings of the center as well as the state government. As a debt manager, the Reserve Bank of India auctions the government securities on behalf of the government. And these government securities are as such auctioned through a separate platform of the RBI referred to as the e-Kuber platform. So this e-Kuber platform, it can be considered to be a core banking solution of the Reserve Bank of India. And this particular platform is presently used by RBI for a number of important activities, including the auctioning of the government securities. These government securities are auctioned in the primary market. So what is primary market? Primary market is basically a market in which new government securities are issued. So whenever the RBI is selling new government securities through the e-Kuber platform, it is itself referred to as the primary market. So in this primary market, you have different participants, different entities who are buying these government securities. And who are these entities? This basically includes the banks, financial institutions, which may include the pension fund companies, mutual fund companies, insurance fund companies, and so on. And it also includes the primary dealers. Now, primary dealers are those entities which have been authorized by the Reserve Bank of India to buy the government securities in the primary market. So only those entities which have been authorized by the RBI to buy the government securities can buy it in the primary market, and such entities are referred to as the primary dealers. So these three categories of investors, they maintain accounts with the RBI. So that is why they can buy the government securities directly from the Reserve Bank of India in the primary market. Now the question is, what about the retail investors? Can the retail investors buy the government securities directly in the primary market from the RBI? Earlier, the retail investors, they were not allowed to buy the government securities directly from the RBI in the primary market. So these retail investors, if they had to buy these new government securities in the primary market, they had to fulfill two conditions. One, they needed to have a demat account, and second, they could have bought the government securities through the intermediaries. So who are these intermediaries? These intermediaries could be banks, financial institutions, and so on. So if you look at the earlier regime, in the earlier regime, retail investors, they were not allowed to buy the government securities from the RBI directly. That's the first thing you need to know. Second thing which is needed to know is, if they wanted to buy the government securities in the primary market, they needed to have a demat account, and they needed to buy the government securities to the intermediaries such as banks, financial institutions, and so on. So that was the earlier regime. But now the RBI has come up with a new scheme known as a retail direct scheme. Under this retail direct scheme, as the name suggests, the retail investors like you and me, we can buy the government securities from the RBI directly. And how can this take place? Retail investors like you and me, we need to open an account with the RBI, which will be referred to as the retail direct gilt account. And once we open an account with the RBI, then directly we can buy these government securities from the primary market from the Reserve Bank of India. So please remember this important development. So to repeat this thing, even earlier also the retail investors were allowed to buy the government securities in the primary market, but the restriction was that they were not allowed to buy the government securities from the RBI directly. They could have bought it by having a demat account through these intermediaries. But now the retail investors can directly buy the government securities from the RBI in the primary market, and that they can do so by opening the retail direct gilt account with the RBI. And this new scheme is referred to as the retail direct scheme. So once these government securities are issued, the trading of these government securities takes place in the secondary market. Now, for example, let's say the ICICI Bank has already bought a government security in the primary market. And now let's say this ICICI Bank wants to sell it off. And let's say the HDFC Bank now wants to buy a government security. So you have a potential seller and a potential buyer. So ICICI can then sell off this government security which it has bought in the primary market to the HDFC in the secondary market. So this trading of government securities takes place in the secondary market, for which we have stock exchanges and negotiated dealing system order matching. For example, under the NSE stock exchange, we have a separate platform for the trading of government securities called as NSE Go Bid. Similarly, in BSE, we have a separate platform for trading of government security called as BSE Direct. Apart from that, the trading of the government securities also takes place in the negotiated dealing system order matching. Now, this particular platform is set up as well as owned by the Reserve Bank of India. But please remember that it is right now operated by the Clearing Corporation of India Limited. So the RBI has authorized the Clearing Corporation of India Limited to operate the negotiated dealing system order matching. So now let us have a look at the question asked in Prelims 2021. Look at the first statement. The first statement is retail investors through the demat account can invest in the treasury bills and the government of India debt bonds in the primary market. So as we have discussed, this particular statement here is correct. Second one is the negotiated dealing system order matching is the government securities trading platform of the Reserve Bank of India. So these two statements are correct. So if you look at the options that are given here, without even knowing whether the option 3 is correct or not, still you can get the right answer. And the right answer happens to be 1 and 2 only. Now coming to the purpose of government's borrowing. See, broadly the government can borrow money either for financing its fiscal deficit or for addressing the temporary mismatches in the cash balances. When it comes to the financing fiscal deficit, now let's say, for example, for the financial year 22-23, for this entire financial year, the government is expected to earn a revenue of rupees 20 lakh crore. So let's say from all the tax or non-tax sources, the government is expected to earn say 20 lakh crore. And the total expenditure obligations for this entire financial year, let's say it is 25 lakh crore. So here the government would be required to borrow an additional 5 lakh crores in order to bridge this deficit. And this is referred to as financing fiscal deficit or the deficit financing. Now coming to the addressing temporary mismatches in the cash balances. Now as I said, for the entire financial year 22-23, say the government is going to earn a revenue worth rupees 20 lakh crore. But this 20 lakh crore it is going to earn in the entire financial year. In different months of the year, the government may earn different amount of revenue. For example, in month of May, it may earn a revenue of 1 lakh crore. In the month of June, it may earn a revenue of 1.2 lakh crore. In month of July, it may earn a revenue of 1.5 lakh crore. In August, it may earn 2 lakh crore. So in different months, it is earning different amount of revenue, and the total amount of revenue for the entire financial year is adding up to rupees 20 lakh crore. This is as far as revenue is concerned. Similarly, when it comes to the expenditure, in different months of the year, the government may spend different amounts. For example, in month of May, it may spend 1.2 lakh crore. In month of June, it may spend 1 lakh crore. But the entire expenditure for the financial year, it will add it up to 25 lakh crore. Now, let's say for the month of May, the government is going to earn a revenue worth rupees 1 lakh crore, but it is going to spend say 1.2 lakh crore. So can I say here that the government is facing a shortage of rupees 20,000 crore? Now, if you see the month of June, the government is going to earn a revenue worth rupees 1.2 lakh crore and it has an expenditure obligation of only 1 lakh crore. So here for the month of June, it is having a surplus of rupees 20,000 crore. So as far as the May month is concerned, here the government is facing a temporary mismatch in the cash balances, wherein the amount of revenue which it is going to earn, it is less than its expenditure obligations. Whereas in the next month, its revenue that it's going to earn, it is more than its expenditure obligations. So here, to address this temporary mismatch of rupees 20,000 crores, the government may borrow 20,000 crores. That is for a short span of time. And in the next month, since the government is going to have a surplus of 20,000 crores, this 20,000 crores can then be repaid by the government. So as you can see, in this particular case, the government is not borrowing money to finance its fiscal deficit. Rather, the government is borrowing money in order to address the temporary mismatch in the cash balances. So as part of temporary mismatches in the cash balances, it may so happen that at a particular point of time, the expected revenue of the government is lower than its expenditure obligations. So during such time, the government will borrow money. This borrowed money will be in turn repaid back when the government has surplus cash with itself. So here the government is not borrowing money to finance its deficit. Rather, the government is borrowing money in order to address the temporary mismatches in the cash balances. And these temporary mismatches in the cash balances are normally addressed through the ways and means advances as well as the cash management bills. So having understood the purposes for which the government borrows money, let us now look into the different sources of the government's borrowing. So as you can see, broadly, the government can borrow money either from the domestic market, that is within India, as well as from the Reserve Bank of India, that is RBI. So from the market, the government can resort to long-term borrowings or the short-term borrowings. So let's have a look at the long-term borrowings first. See, the central government, in order to borrow long-term loans, the central government issues what is referred to as the dated securities. So these dated securities, they will have a face value, they will carry a rate of interest, and it will have a maturity period. So while the central government issues the dated securities, the state government issues what is referred to as the state development loans. So what you need to understand here is that both center as well as the state government can borrow long-term loans from the market. For the center, if it wants to borrow money, it will issue the dated securities, whereas the state government issues the state development loans. Apart from that, we have certain special dated government securities. For example, the central government has issued certain special government securities such as the oil bonds, the recapitalization bonds, sovereign gold bonds, and when it comes to state government, the state government have issued the Uday bonds. Now coming to the short-term borrowings from the market, please do understand here that the short-term borrowings, it is right now allowed only for the central government. So the state government as such, they are not allowed to borrow short-term loans from the market. And in order to borrow the short-term loans, the central government issues what is referred to as the treasury bills. So these treasury bills are auctioned by the Reserve Bank of India on the behalf of the central government. So these treasury bills, they can have a maturity period ranging from T91 to 364. So broadly, there are three types of treasury bills depending upon the maturity period, that is T91, T182 and T364. So as you can see, the short-term borrowings are always for a period less than 1 year, whereas the long-term borrowings are for a period greater than 1 year. These treasury bills, they are normally issued at a discount and then redeemed at a face value. For example, let's say the face value of a particular treasury bill is rupees 100, but it may be issued at rupees 95. So if I as an investor, if I buy a treasury bill, I can buy this treasury bill at rupees 95, but the face value of this treasury bill is rupees 100. Upon the maturity, let's say this treasury bill is T91. So after 91 days, I as an investor will get rupees 100. So initially, when I have bought this treasury bill, I have bought it at rupees 95. And upon the maturity period, when the treasury bill is redeemed, the money which I get back is rupees 100. So the profit which I am going to make here is rupees 5. So please understand here, the treasury bills, they are issued at discount and redeemed at a face value. So as such, they do not carry any interest. Similar to treasury bills, you have the cash management bills. So these cash management bills, they are similar to the treasury bills. As you can see, the cash management bills, they are issued at a discount and then redeemed at a face value. These cash management bills are basically used in order to address the temporary mismatches in the cash balances of the central government. But one important difference between treasury bill and the cash management bill is the minimum maturity period of a treasury bill is T91. However, the maturity period of the cash management bill is less than 91 days. So if the government requires money for a period less than 90 days, normally it goes for the cash management bills. And if it requires money for a period greater than 90 days, then it goes for the issuance of the treasury bills. Now coming to the borrowings from the Reserve Bank of India. Let's first discuss about the short-term borrowings. So as I discussed, when it comes to market, from the market only the central government can borrow the short-term loans and not the state government. But when it comes to borrowings from the RBI, both center as well as state government can resort to the short-term borrowings. In fact, the FRBM Act 2003 provides that the Reserve Bank of India can lend loans to the center and states in order to address the temporary mismatches in the cash balances. And these temporary mismatches in the cash balances, they are basically addressed through the ways and means advances provided by the Reserve Bank of India. So the ways and means advances, it can be considered to be a loan facility of RBI, which is right now available to both center as well as state government, and this is basically used in order to address the temporary mismatches in the cash balances. The maturity period of the ways and means advances is 90 days. The rate of interest which the center or the state government is required to pay to the RBI is equal to the repo rate, and normally there is a limit which is imposed on the ways and means advances, and this particular limit is mutually decided by the RBI and the concerned government. Apart from that, what if this particular limit is breached? Let's say we have set a particular limit on ways and means advances for a particular financial year, and let's say the limit is already breached. Will the government be able to borrow over and above the limit? Yes. The government can borrow money over and above the limit which is imposed under the ways and means advances. But here, the interest rate that it is required to pay, it will be 2% more than the repo rate. Now, for example, up to the limit which is imposed on the ways and means advances, the government is required to pay an interest rate which is equal to the repo rate. So let's say the repo rate is equal to 4%. But beyond that limit, it is required to pay 4% plus 2%, 6% rate of interest. So this ability of either the center or the state to borrow beyond the limit which is imposed under the ways and means advances, it is referred to as the overdraft facility. So overdraft facility is indeed allowed under the ways and means advances, but the restriction here is the rate of interest. So the rate of interest will be 2% more than the prevailing repo rate. So this is as far as the short-term borrowings is concerned. Now the question is with respect to long-term borrowings. Can the government borrow long-term loans from the RBI in order to finance its fiscal deficit? That is, can the government of India undertake direct monetization of its deficit? So what do you mean by monetization of deficit? Now if you go back to the previous slide here, as I said, the government can borrow money in order to finance its fiscal deficit. So here the government can borrow rupees 5 lakh crores. Now the question is, can this 5 lakh crore be borrowed from the Reserve Bank of India? And if it is borrowing from the RBI, it is referred to as monetization of government's deficit. Why monetization? Because here the deficit as such gets monetized by printing currency notes. See, in most of the online sources, it has been wrongly mentioned that direct monetization of government's deficit is not permitted in India. Please do understand here that direct monetization of government's deficit is indeed permitted in India. However, it is permitted only under certain exceptional circumstances. Now, if you carefully read the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act 2003, it specifies that in normal circumstances, the Reserve Bank of India should not lend long-term loans to the government to finance its deficit. That is, in normal circumstances, there is a restriction on the direct monetization of government's deficit. But at the same time, under certain exceptional circumstances, the government can very well resort to direct monetization of its deficit. And what are these exceptional circumstances? This can include national security, war, collapse of agriculture, structural reforms, and so on. I hope all of you must have studied that the fiscal deficit in case of India, it can be increased by 0.5%, and this is referred to as an escape clause. And this escape clause can be invoked in certain exceptional circumstances. And once again, these exceptional circumstances are national security, war, collapse of agriculture, structural reforms, and so on. So on similar grounds, the government can undertake direct monetization of its deficit. So these are the important things which you must understand as far as this particular article is concerned. Now let us take up the practice MCQ number 3. The question here is, which among the following are eligible to be considered as government securities for the statutory liquidity ratio? I hope all of you must have studied that a certain percentage of depositors' money the banks are required to keep with themselves as part of the statutory liquidity ratio. and this money has to be kept in the form of cash, gold, or the government securities. So the question is, when you say this government security, what are these government securities which can be considered as part of SLR? So most of you would know that it is a government securities would have to be kept as part of SLR. But problem is students do not know as to which all government securities are eligible as part of the SLR. So here the options are dated securities, state development loans, cash management bills, treasury bills, and special government securities such as oil bonds and recap bonds. Please to understand here that as per the detailed guidelines issued by the Reserve Bank of India, dated securities, state development loans, cash management bills, treasury bills, all of this are eligible securities under the SLR. Whereas the special government securities such as oil bonds, Uday bonds, recap bonds, etc., they are not eligible securities under the SLR. So if a bank has invested in say oil bonds or recap bonds, then such investments cannot be counted as part of the SLR investment by the banks. Apart from this question, you have the other 6 questions, that is practice question number 1, practice question number 2, and then practice question number 4, 5, 6 and 7. I would want each one of you to pause this video for 5 minutes. In the next 5 minutes, try to find out the answers to these questions. And after finding out the answers after 5 minutes, let me know the answers in the comment section with your scores. Let's see how many of you will be able to get all the questions right. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 8. The article is titled as "The Central Government Introduced the Antarctica Bill." This article shall be important both from the perspective of Indian polity as well as environment and biodiversity. From the perspective of this particular article, there are basically 2 things that you must understand from the perspective of UPSC Prelims examination. One is the details related to the Antarctic Treaty, and second one is the important provisions of the Indian Antarctic Bill 2022, which the government has recently presented or introduced in the Lok Sabha. So keeping in mind the requirement of the UPSC Prelims examination, let us look into various aspects of this particular article, starting with the Antarctic Treaty. Now the Antarctic Treaty basically defines Antarctica as all the land as well as the ice shelves which lies south of the 60-degree latitude. So please understand that this is a definition of what constitutes Antarctica as per the Antarctic Treaty and becomes important from the perspective of the prelims examination. So I hope all of you must be knowing that Antarctica as such it is considered to be a global common, which basically means that no country has a single ownership over the entire continent. So the Antarctic as such is commonly owned by all the people of the world. Antarctica as such has no indigenous population of its own, but as of now almost like thousands of people are living in Antarctica, and all of these people, they are living in the research stations which have been set up by countries across the world. So the Antarctic Treaty as such came into being in the year 1959 and it was initially signed by 12 countries. As of now, the Antarctic Treaty has 54 member countries, including India. So the Antarctic Treaty basically provides that Antarctica should be used only for peaceful purposes, that is for the purposes related to research and development. Further, it restricts the countries from building any kind of military bases in Antarctica. Further, the Antarctica Treaty also provides for the freedom of scientific investigation, which means that the countries are allowed to set up the research stations in Antarctica. So accordingly, various countries such as China and so on, they have set up their research stations. Now, if you are allowing a particular country to carry out scientific investigation by setting up a research station, what can then happen is, then such a particular country can claim sovereignty over a part of Antarctica. Now, for example, let's say China has set up its research station in Antarctica. What if China starts claiming the land belongs to it in future? Hence, in order to prevent such claims by the countries, the Antarctica Treaty provides that no country should be able to claim sovereignty over Antarctica solely on the basis that they have set up the research stations there. Nextly, it also prevents the member countries from carrying out any kind of nuclear explosion or from carrying out the disposal of the radioactive waste. And under this particular treaty, the member countries are required to take appropriate efforts by laying down laws, rules, and regulations to abide by the provisions of this particular treaty. So, if you look at the relationship between India and Antarctica, this treaty, as I said earlier, it initially came into being in the year 1959, but India signed this treaty much later in the year 1983. Apart from that, we have a Convention on Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. As the name suggests, this particular convention seeks to protect the marine resources of Antarctica. India has ratified this convention in the year 1985. And then we have a protocol to the Antarctic Treaty known as the Protocol on the Environmental Protection. As the name suggests, this particular protocol ensures that the countries take adequate measures in order to protect the pristine environment of Antarctica. India has signed even this particular protocol in the year 1998. Further, also do note that this particular protocol on the environmental protection to Antarctic Treaty, it is also referred to as the Madrid Protocol. India has so far set up 3 research stations in Antarctica, which include the Dakshin Gangotri, Maitri, and Bharati. But as of now, the Dakshin Gangotri stands decommissioned. So that is why India has only 2 operating research stations in Antarctica, which include Maitri and Bharati. From the perspective of the prelims examination, please do note that these research stations that we have in Antarctica, they are managed by the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research Institute based in Goa, and this particular institute functions under the Ministry of Earth Sciences. Further, recently, in the month of November 2021, India had launched its 41st scientific expedition to Antarctica. Now coming to the details about the Indian Antarctic Bill 2022. Firstly, let's understand as to what was the need to introduce this particular bill. See, as I said, a number of countries have set up the research stations in Antarctica. For example, China has set up around 5 research stations. Russia has also set up its research stations. Similarly, Argentina has almost more than 10 research stations in Antarctica. India also has 2 operating research stations. Now, we need to ensure that no unlawful activities takes place in these research stations. Unlawful activities such as illegal mining, pollution, etc. should not take place in these research stations. Accordingly, the Madrid Protocol calls upon the member countries to formulate their own laws, rules, regulations in order to prevent the illegal activities which may take place within their own research stations. For example, whatever research stations that we have, we need to ensure that in these research stations no illegal activities take place. Similarly, whatever research stations China has set up, in these research stations we need to ensure that no illegal activities take place. So for the research stations in China, China will have its own domestic law, and for the research stations for India, India would have its own domestic law. So the member countries are required to formulate their domestic laws, rules and regulations in order to prevent the unlawful activities in their research stations. That's the first thing. Apart from that, we also need to give effect to the various provisions of Antarctic Treaty as well as the Madrid Protocol. And to give effect to the Antarctic Treaty and the Madrid Protocol, we need to have our own domestic legislation. And that is why the Indian government has decided to introduce the Indian Antarctic Bill 2022. This particular bill shall be applicable to the Indian citizens. It shall be applicable to the foreign citizens. It shall be applicable to the companies registered in India, and it shall be applicable to any vessel or aircraft registered in India or even outside India. Now, the restriction here is such a vessel or an aircraft should be part of the Indian expedition to Antarctica. Only then this particular law would be applicable. So if you have any ship or aircraft which may be registered in India, but it is not part of the Indian expedition to Antarctica, so in that case, such a ship or an aircraft will not be brought under the ambit of this particular bill. Only when a ship or an aircraft which is part of India's expedition to Antarctica is involved, only then the bill would be applicable. That's the first thing that you need to understand. Second thing here is, very interestingly, this particular bill also extends to foreign citizens. Now, similar to India, even other countries such as Australia have come up with their own domestic legislations in order to protect the environment of Antarctica. But specifically, if you look at the Australian law, it provides that such a law will also be applicable to the foreign citizens. But here it says that it will be applicable to only those foreign citizens who are part of the Australian expedition to Antarctica. However, as far as the Indian law is concerned, the Indian law makes this particular law applicable to all the foreign citizens, irrespective of whether they are part of the Indian expedition to Antarctica or not. So that is why some of the opposition MPs had opposed this particular provision when it was introduced in the Lok Sabha. That's the first thing that you need to understand. Secondly, some of the opposition MPs had also opposed the introduction of this particular bill on the grounds that how can the Indian government make a law over Antarctica over which it has no power to impose legislation. So the opposition parties had questioned the government as to how can the government of India make extraterritorial legislation, particularly when Indian government does not control Antarctica. In response, the Indian government has replied that we have come up with such a bill in order to give effect to the Antarctic Treaty as well as protocol. Various other countries have also come up with their own domestic legislation. For example, I said about Australia. So since other countries have already come up with a domestic legislation, even India needs to come up with a domestic legislation in order to regulate the activities which are taking place on Antarctica. So this was the government's stand. So let us wait and watch as to how this particular discussion on the Indian Antarctic bill unfolds in future. So keeping that aside, let's look into the important provisions of the bill. First and foremost, this particular bill seeks to set up an apex level committee known as the Committee on Antarctic Governance and Environmental Protection, which will be headed by Secretary, Ministry of Earth Sciences. The main mandate of this particular committee would be to monitor, implement and ensure the compliance of the relevant international laws for the protection of the Antarctic environment. Apart from this, this particular bill categorizes the various activities which can be carried out in Antarctica into the regulated activities and the prohibited activities. So some of the permitted and regulated activities on Antarctica include the Indian expedition to Antarctica, setting up of the Indian research station in Antarctica, vessels and aircrafts entering into Antarctica, and more importantly, please look at this particular provision. The provision here is introduction of non-native animals and plants into Antarctica, which is also a permitted and regulated activity and not a prohibited activity. As far as these activities are concerned, all of these activities are regulated. Regulated means you need to take a prior approval. So as far as the prior approval is concerned, we can take a prior approval based upon the permit which will be issued by the Committee on Antarctic Governance and Environmental Protection. So this is one way of getting an approval, or we can get a written authorization from the other party to the Madrid Protocol, which means here that if you want to carry out any of these activities, either we can get a permit from the Committee of Antarctic Governance and Environmental Protection set up in India, or we can get a written authorization from any other party to the Madrid Protocol. For example, let's say, Japan is a member of Madrid Protocol. So we can get a written authorization from Japan before carrying out any of these activities. As far as the prohibited activities are concerned, some of the prohibited activities include nuclear explosion, disposal of radioactive waste material, introduction of certain specified substances or products which can harm the Antarctic environment. So these are some important aspects which you must understand from the perspective of this particular article. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 1. The article is titled as Chief Justice of India flags the falling credibility of Central Bureau of Investigation. See, as far as this particular article is concerned, this article becomes important mainly with respect to GS paper 2, Polity and Governance. From the perspective of the prelims examination, you should be aware about various details about CBI, such as its establishment, its functioning, and more importantly, the general consent of the states, which was in news recently. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be aware about various problems with the functioning of CBI and what kind of reforms are needed in the Central Bureau of Investigation. Now, all of these aspects of Central Bureau of Investigation, which becomes important from the perspective of prelims as well as the mains examination, I have already covered it in the DNS dated 2nd of December 2021. So as you can see in this particular DNS, I have discussed various aspects such as the establishment, about the general consent of the states, the appointment of the CBI director, the current issues, as well as the reforms needed. So those of you who have not gone through this particular DNS, I would suggest you to go through this particular DNS in order to comprehensively understand various aspects of the CBI. Apart from that, there is a small correction here. As you can see here, I have written that the CBI director is appointed for a tenure of 2 years. But in the month of December 2021, the Parliament of India has passed a new bill, and under the provisions of this particular bill, the tenure of the CBI director has been extended to 5 years. So that's a change with respect to the previous DNS. All other things remain same. The next article appears on page number 12. Now, this particular article highlights that the overall GST collections in the month of March 2022 have increased to record high of 1.42 lakh crore. Now, this GST collection in the month of March 2022, this is much higher than the GST collections in the month of March, which stood at 1.4 lakh crores. So from the perspective of UPSC prelims and mains examination, various things become important. For example, from the perspective of prelims, you must understand the trends in the GST collection, the GST council, and more importantly, the concept of the revenue neutrality with respect to GST. And as far as the mains examination is concerned, one should be able to carry out a critical analysis of GST regime. That is the pros and cons with respect to GST regime. Now, all of these aspects, both from the perspective of prelims as well as mains examination, I have already covered it in the DNS dated 1st of May 2021. So please go through this particular DNS dated 1st of May 2021 to understand all the phases related to the goods and service tax. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day.